Welcome, everybody. This week's update on February 10th, we decided to focus on one issue alone, and that is the impact of AI on the job market. We often hear in other podcasts that they say they're starting to feel the singularity. Now, I'm just feeling a sense of unease and certainly some discomfort when we're looking at what's coming. And I'm not sure if that's the singularity or maybe just something else, but we thought it was important just to really focus on this issue today. And so we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into how AI is coming for jobs.
Yeah, and it really got me thinking. There have been a few articles that have come out over the last few days that I had been texting to you. So when I was kind of putting the slides together, kind of thought we really wanted to hit these. Three articles kind of really stood out. The first one is just saying it's about people who advise, provide financial advice to billionaires to help them manage all their money. And they're saying, look, even these people are really worried about their kids getting jobs, right? And these are kids who have a lot of opportunities educationally. They have a lot of strong, obviously, social connections for someone to give them a job. But they're like, hey, we don't know if our kids are going to have jobs. And they're encouraging, and we'll talk more about this later, they're encouraging their kids to become entrepreneurs. The second is one of the major law firms is that it's laying off basically about 10% of their staff, which is around 700 people. And they're basically saying because it's AI. I emailed the article to a friend of ours. Excuse me, I emailed the article to a friend of ours, David Cole, who's a lawyer, who's been using AI, who's also been concerned about this issue. And he said, oh, well, this law firm, they often lay off a lot of people, but it's never really been because of AI. And if you read the article, it just says, and it lists the type of jobs, like secretarial jobs, administrative jobs, paralegal jobs, stuff that people are saying can be automated with AI. And that's where the layoffs are happening. And then this third article is a longer story in the Atlantic, and I think it's in the March issue, the monthly issue, but it's available online, and it's a really long article, and it goes through kind of some of the arguments for and against whether or not AI cause unemployment, but really kind of explains different reasons why it's going to happen, and we're going to talk about some of those in the podcast. Everyone, like you're saying, we watch some other podcasts, especially this Moonshots podcast, talking about how it's going to replace all knowledge workers, and people just aren't prepared for this. And, obviously, this is the AIX higher education podcast. It's not the kind of the job kind of retraining podcast or the economist podcast, but ultimately universities are preparing students for jobs, and high schools are preparing students to enter those universities with the skills that should complement or prepare them for that university education that should prepare them for a job. But if there are just fewer jobs, and we need different types of jobs, and kind of that line between what you learn in university in the job market is broken, then the line between what you're learning in high school to prepare you for universities is broken as well.
Now, there are a lot of caveats to this, of course, and no one can say definitively that it's going to happen a particular way. Many economists are thinking that it probably will have some disruptive force, of course. Even the most conservative estimates suggest that there will be some disruption. It's a question of how that's going to play out. And so we'll get into that a little bit. Let's start with some discussion of the scale of the threat. 71% of Americans are now worried that AI will put people out of work permanently. Some 40% of jobs worldwide could be affected by AI per the International Monetary Fund, and 10 to 20% unemployment rise is predicted within the next 5 years. And that's according to Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic. There's also been discussion from CEOs of Anthropic and Ford that half of white-collar jobs could be eliminated in the next decade. And when you look at job cuts at Baker McKenzie, 700 plus jobs that Stefan was mentioning, this is in a number of different areas. These weren't lawyers, but they were all part of the back end, the administrative workings of the firm. And they were saying explicitly attributed to AI restructuring. So it's not about cutting back or firing people because the firm's not doing well or companies aren't doing well. It's doing it because of efficiency and redundancy. And so that's creating a really weird tension and a very different kind of job scenario than we're accustomed to.
And, here's just a few examples, right, of what people have been saying, right? AI could wipe out half of all entry-level jobs, white-collar jobs, that's the knowledge work jobs, so jobs people didn't think we'd ever get to, that, you're going to be able to build a business with one or just a couple. Some people say you'd want to have a friend, I'd rather build a business with you on and then just sit in my house all day and, build it by myself. But that obviously kind of begs the question, right? We just wouldn't need that many employees. And, it says like framing layoffs as automation and headcount trending down, that investors like want to see that, right? Like if you have fewer, generally your employees is like one of your biggest, it costs, right? Labor is expensive. So investors see, oh, okay, you got your headcount down. We're going to make greater profits. They also, in the Atlantic article, talks about this explicitly. CEOs are under pressure to reduce the headcounts, regardless of how well the AI is working, because their boards are saying, well, hey, you invested all this money in AI. It's supposed to cause automation. We expect the headcount to go down. So boards want headcount to go down, regardless of how well the company is doing or even how well the, AI is working within reasons. And it's saying now too, the CEOs are a little bit like, they were kind of talking about this. This was kind of like an abstract idea. Oh, it's going to replace jobs. We've been talking about that for a long time, but now it's like the PR machines are saying like, hey, maybe don't be so public about this. Though I think some of the ones, and it does mention Dario Amode, who's, Amode at Anthropic, who's always talking about it. And there's an economist who studies this. He's actually on like the Anthropic Economic Advisory Council, but it says he's not paid, right? So he's just by them. He's just giving his honest opinion. He's like, well, we need to like listen to these people. We can't, so many people say, oh, they're just lying. They're like trying to raise money. He's like, I think a lot of them are genuinely concerned, and they're trying to give a heads up as to what's happening.
A couple of different dynamics here that are worth teasing out and to pull these threads a little. If you think about an established corporation, the pressure to reduce headcount has always been there, even before AI. And so there's always been the need to try and show that by reducing labor costs that you can actually save money for the company, even while you're growing. And so that's not really a new trend. It's that there's a new set of tools that CEOs can employ to be able to do that in a more radical fashion. The other part of this about $1 billion company with just one employee, this is also part of an ongoing trend. And we'll get into this a little bit with discussion of entrepreneurial endeavors. But this idea of having $1 billion company, maybe a generation ago, you would need thousands or 10,000 employees to be able to get to that. Recently, in the last few years, it's gotten down to some companies having 1,000 or a few hundred employees. Recently, there have been some that have only had like 20 employees, and they're getting to the point where they're suggesting it could be one founder starting $1 billion company. And it's because the efficiency of the systems and being able to automate so much of the work can be done. That doesn't mean they're laying off people. It just means they're not hiring. Now, the optimistic view of that could be that if a lot of people start companies that are all successful and it leads to a lot of growth, then that doesn't mean that there's a lot of job disruption in that sector of the economy. But we really have to be focusing on what happens to a lot of the traditional companies that many of our students go and get jobs in. And if they're looking at looking for efficiencies, if they're reducing headcount, then that's going to be a concern, even if there's further growth in the economy. Now, knowledge work is the target, and that's something they've been talking about for quite a while. And the focus, of course, was finding a way to automate software development. And part of the reason for that, and we've mentioned this on previous episodes, is that if an AI company is able to automate software production, and really means automating computer science, then they're able to get to the point where they can use those tools internally to be able to rapidly integrate into their own workflows, to be able to more quickly develop new AI models. And that's certainly what we're seeing in any of the big AI model companies. And they've even talked about how they're reducing the number of people they're hiring. They're not really letting anybody go, but they don't need to bring in as many employees because they're able to get one computer scientist to do the work of 10 before, because they're able to use Claude Code or Codex. So you see examples of this, and we've talked about Dario Amodei talking about this, but this is also now we're reaching a tipping point that it's not just happening internally. A really important story that's happened in the last couple of weeks has been the introduction of some of the plugins that are available for Claude's Cowork. We've talked a bit about Cowork. It's a lot like Claude Code, but it's meant for people to be able to use without coding experience. You don't have to use a terminal. Well, they've introduced these plugins, and there are about 14 of them that are available now from Anthropic. I think others are building them too. But one of them in particular that's mentioned in the slide is a legal plugin. And it was one that allows for you to do the work within Cowork that you might have a paralegal do for contract review. Now, that's not doing all of the work of a lawyer or a paralegal, but it's doing doing a lot of the substantive work. And I remember I tested this out this last week, and it's remarkably good in terms of writing a markup for a contract. I used a template that we've used for agreements, and it was doing a great job of doing a markup, of redlining to be able to offer suggestions, changes from a legal perspective. Of course, that's not something you would just take and then use on your own and just submit it, but it really does move you ahead on that. And the reason why that led to a removal of billions of dollars from SaaS companies overnight is that why would you pay for an expensive subscription if you can get this with a $20 a month subscription on Claude? Now, that's a little short-sighted, of course, but what we really are looking at is that with the development of these plugins and the development of very specific tools within a platform that you're able to get, even at the upper end, probably a couple $100 a month, that's a lot cheaper than an employee, and it's able to work 24/7. And when we're able to get to the point of the agents that are able to use these plugins to do much of the work of the staff that you would have in a law firm or that you would do with marketing, they have others for financial analysts. It is remarkable the skills that are available currently with these platforms. And we're finding that there's certainly a bit of a fear going across the stock market because they're thinking that a lot of these software services companies are in real danger of losing market share. If you have a small company, small business, you might want to be able to just vibe code and develop your own tool and be able to do that on your own instead of having to pay for an expensive subscription with a bigger company. Now, some other items here that are worth noting. Dave Blunden, who is on the Moonshots podcast that we mentioned a few times ago, he's mentioned the worry about what this might lead to in terms of great job loss, panic in the streets, political instability, and referencing that the people that are in the building, the people that are developing this, are sounding the alarm. They see that this has a potential, that this could happen. One university president was talking about how university labs could be wiped out and saying, hey, we're cooked if this kind of automated scientific process is going on. It's going to have implications for the work we do within the university. And then another speaker, Salim Ismail, who's also on Moonshots, talked about how we probably need to change the way we're educating people, no longer thinking about employment, but start thinking about educating for agency, adaptability, ethical judgment. And that's not to say that they aren't going to be getting jobs, but we really have to prepare our students for a very different kind of economy. At the extreme case, and I don't know how likely it could possibly be, but if they don't have to work, they need to have a different type of preparation for that society. And maybe there is a universal basic income. More likely, we're talking about a different role of agency for the individual. When they enter the job market, it's no longer going into a traditional entry-level job because many of those are going away. And those are the ones that are probably the easiest to be automated. We need to prepare our students for that kind of agency, adaptability, and ethical judgment to be able to do more advanced work, more sophisticated work from the beginning. And I think that there's a real potential for us to be able to do that. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But we as educators need to be able to very quickly retool and to consider how do we prepare our students for these new challenges. It's going to be tough. It's going to be very difficult.
Yeah. And I would just add, there's kind of this debate, right, that's gone on. Okay, AI is a technology. New technologies have generated like new jobs. It gives the example, like, in the accounting when they had Excel, now there's like more accountants, right? Like things shift and, the economy could grow. Like, as you pointed out, okay, well, if there's growth, there's more demand. Generally, when there's more demand, more people historically have been hired, that it will take a while. I mean, obviously the advances, today we're not going to cover the advances, but if you watched our podcast or follow anything that's going on in AI, see how rapid the advances are. And obviously they're not getting fully integrated into the economy as rapidly as they're advancing. So some people are just saying, hey, this is going to take like a very long time. And the Atlantic article gives the example of the second industrial revolution when we had the electricity, but the way the factories and everything were organized, they had to like change all the configurations, and that took a very long time, right? So, and of course, we were only, there's not really like a lot of hard data that it's, causing at least significant unemployment. I mean, 700 people in a law firm is kind of a big deal, but it's not, look across the economy, it's not there. So that's kind of it'll be fine thing. But, there's contrary things, right? Like AI is software. I've kind of made this argument from the beginning, right? Like when electricity came out, right, you had to build the lines, right? All across the cities. And then, you had to reconfigure the factories. But the AI, like most people have a laptop or at least a phone. In our book, we talk about that, like, how the distribution is is kind of already there. Second, and this one economist who I was referencing earlier is, advises Anthropic, to just kind of without pay. He's like, the machines can roll themselves out. They don't need the people, right? And a lot of this is like, well, the people aren't trained, they're kind of resisting it. Well, okay, if the people resist it and they're not going to be additive, the companies can just kind of get rid of the people and have the software just go. It can go and it can learn on its own. And it can just kind of start implementing a lot of the functions. And then this third argument I've also made is that, the competition is going to force this, right? If you're an insurance company, you're one of the major insurance companies, and the other major insurance, just one of the similar companies in where you compete figures out how to use AI, and you don't, you're doomed, right? They're going to be able to offer the same level of insurance for a fraction of the cost, and you can then just take that and apply it everywhere. So, and I think, there's this point, we have to at least consider this, the possibility. And here, quotes Anton Kardec at UVA, another economist in this article, Armada Shehu at George Mason. She made this point in a recent Substack where, 16,000 people at Amazon lost their job. And she said, okay, well, it's hard to prove exactly, maybe there were some people there who lost their jobs, not because of AI. Like, again, like Austin Goolsbee, who is a debater, I believe, or a speaker, maybe did extent, like says, okay, well, we don't necessarily have all this hard data. And, he's a hard data kind of guy, but she said, well, we can't just keep waiting. Like there's something going on and you can't ignore it. So I think part of our call to action today is that can't just keep ignoring this. So are we going to wait till unemployment's at 15%? Maybe decide we want to think about doing something. That's when you get the chaos that Dave Bundin talks about. That's when you get parents like running to school administrations and school boards being like, well, what are you doing? And, it's at 9%. And the school board's like, oh, well, when it gets to 15%, then we'll start thinking about it, right? It's kind of not a recipe. Like this is obviously coming. It's just a question of the degree and the speed and, all these kind of things. So the time to think is now.
And we also don't want to be making decisions that are really rash, that are in the heat of the moment. We're already running out of time. I think that there's a concern about waiting too long before we have these discussions. I think there is an optimistic path forward. There is a potential that we could kind of re-envision what we do to prepare students for this and to lessen any shock that might be there. But we're looking at an economy that, if they're right, and as Anton Kardec talks about, at least consider the possibility that what some of these theorists are saying could be true. It'll be a really strange transition because there will be a lot of growth. There will be a lot of money in the economy. It's just not going to be evenly distributed. And that's going to be a real concern, is that the gap between those who are getting really rich off of the integration of AI is going to grow tremendously. And we already have a lot of disparity between different socioeconomic classes now, greater than probably in other points in history. It's going to be nothing compared to what they're suggesting could happen if we get into this kind of a scenario. And it's the speed of the variable that really matters. If we look at past revolutions, past changes in technology, you had a slow fade. You had elevator operators that no longer had to be employed because they were automated. Toll booth attendants that were, the toll booths were then eventually automated. You had a 3% maybe annual attrition that was barely noticed. It was something that could be managed. You could retool, you could reskill, train employees. You had some employees that retired, and that allowed for that transition. That was certainly something that was much easier to absorb within the system. If you look at the China shock, there were a lot of manufacturing jobs lost in just 6 years after China joined the World Trade Organization. Workers in those regions still haven't recovered, and we live with the political consequences of that. And you hear about this, certainly we think about it nationally more often, unfortunately, during political campaigns than any other time. But that's something that was more shocking and certainly more difficult, and that happened over 6 years. And if we're looking at an AI shock, it's unlike trade, where you're worried about putting up, any of the infrastructure other than maybe data centers, and maybe that'll constrain it a little bit, but probably not that much. AI is not confined to geography, and it's going to happen not just in developing world or the developed world. It could happen everywhere, and it hits knowledge work everywhere simultaneously. If it happens anywhere close to the speed with which they're suggesting it could, institutions are going to have a hard time adapting. Individual companies will certainly have a hard time adapting. As Stefan already outlined, there's going to be a tremendous market pressure for companies to try and keep up with what other companies are doing, and to say, we have to be able to cut our costs at the same rate as the other companies are going to. So even if a company's not looking to or has the incentive to try and lay off a lot of workers, they will probably have to, just because they want to be able to remain competitive within that market. Then we also have institutions like political and social institutions that are going to have a very hard time trying to adapt. And we'll talk a little bit about this more in a later slide, but thinking about how difficult it would be for our political system to be able to deal with that kind of crisis. Maybe you look at 2008 and you think about how the government and the US federal government reacted to the banking crisis and the housing market collapse. If you think about the reaction to COVID and the trillions of dollars that were dumped into the economy to try and get us through, in both of those scenarios, they were reacting to an action, they were reacting to a situation, a scenario that was intended to be or anticipated to be short-lived, not something that would radically change the economy and persist. So this is a very different kind of shock. You can't just pump a lot of money into the economy, and unless you're really thinking about a reliable universal basic income, which is really not something that is talked about in any realistic way within political structures right now. It's going to be hard to imagine how they're able to get by for more than a few months with the kinds of mechanisms that they've used before. So
Yeah, and
think about this key insight at the bottom about 3% annual change invisible, 30% shift is a crisis, but this is an entirely different level in terms of the kind of shock.
I was just going to say that there's kind of two basic ways you can pump money into the economy, right? One is to lower interest rates. If you lower interest rates, these companies that are building out the AI, they're going to borrow even more money, right? I mean, they've generally been taking on investments, some of them using their own funds, but now some of them resorting to borrowing. If you lower the interest rates, they're going to borrow even more money and automate even faster, right? The second way is you can, push, so you could give everyone a stimulus check, right? But what's that going to do, right? It's going to increase the number of, DoorDash orders and, people using AI, and it's just going to kind of stimulate the top of the economy. That could probably help a little bit in the short term. Obviously, you are giving money. It's like a little bit of UBI-ish. It kind of creates demand, but the idea of demand is that then, industry A would buy from industry B, would buy from industry C, consumers. But now like AI is essentially taking a cut of that and even replacing some of the elements of the economy. So a cash stimulus could help the poor, people who are losing their jobs. They're not even necessarily people who are poor, right? Just people who are losing their jobs in difficult circumstances. But it's not sustainable, right? Like you can't, we gave stimulus checks, right, during COVID because it was meant to be short term. But, we definitely can't, just give stimulus checks forever without a radical restructuring of the economy. And, who's getting hit? This is one thing that really hit me in the article. The unemployment rate for recent college grads is 9.7%. It's actually higher than the unemployment rate in the rest of the economy, which shows there's, I think, two potential things. One, there's a crack in like what college is training people for relative to the demand of skills. But second is expectations, right? Obviously, you could graduate from college and go do one of the other jobs in the economy, where the unemployment rate is lower, but that's not your expectation, right? You're aiming for a knowledge worker job, and you might just kind of hope to get a higher wage because you have student loans to pay off, right? The second thing is there is a decline in employment in these ages, 22 to 25, right? I mean, my own son is in that age and looking for a job after finishing his internship. And, we recognize some of these things earlier. Baker McKenzie, 700. The Amazon, actually, it should say 16,000, not 600,000, 600,000. But we'll talk about that actually a little bit at the end of the podcast. But, 16,000 jobs there. So, it hurts. Like, I mean, I don't know anyone who thinks the new Department of Unemployment Statistics is supposed to come out, I think, tomorrow. And we'll see. But I know even the stuff I saw a couple of weeks ago was that there's, a lot of job loss and hardly any job gains.
This gets back to a point Stefan was mentioning earlier in the fear that even billionaires are worried about their kids. And if they're worried about the kids, what about the rest of us? If you have ultra wealthy clients who are concerned that their children who have all the privilege and all the opportunities won't be able to sustain careers in many of these traditional fields, these traditional paths, competitive schools, prestigious internships, corporate ladder, the privilege that allows them these opportunities no longer feels reliable. And that is certainly a pretty big red flag as a concern that that's going to be true for really anyone. And the pivot to that is something that we've mentioned already, and that's entrepreneurship. I think what we're looking at is a real change in the dynamic of the economy. And this is where I think there's some great opportunity in this article that Stefan mentioned. And it's one of the three that he showed on the earlier slide, where they talk about how ultra wealthy individuals are encouraging their kids to be entrepreneurs. And maybe they wouldn't have done that as easily before, or been as likely to do that before, but they're funding their children's startups because it makes sense to them if they can fund even multiple, and they expect that some of the startups aren't going to be successful. But even if they fail a couple of times or they find something that fits, that'll help them launch. They'll be able to build some resilience, their adaptability, and they'll be able to then build their own wealth. And that's the goal for these parents. Really, the goal should be for all of us to make sure that our students are developing some of these traits. And it's not just about going and starting your own company, but even being able to do that internally. In business, it's talked about not just entrepreneurship, but intrapreneurship, to think about developing these traits that increase the value of the individual as a worker, being able to look at problems, to be able to identify solutions to those problems, and in particular, being able to use some of the AI tools to have greater leverage to identify and then solve those problems. That level of entrepreneurship is something that we've always seen as a small sector of the economy, and that only a few students really pursue. And they go into programs. Not even all students in a business program will think about entrepreneurship, usually a small subset. What we're really advocating for, and what we're finding in articles like this, is that there's a greater need for all students to develop some of these entrepreneurial skills, not necessarily to start their own companies or try to have their own billion-dollar company. But I think what we're going to be looking at for any type of job dynamic, of job market dynamic, of economy where people are continuing to work, it's going to be demanding a lot more flexibility. There'll be a lot of flux, a lot of change. We're probably not going to see many jobs anymore where you're able to do the same job for an entire career. And that's something that's been fading over the last generation or two. But we're going to see a radical change where individuals need to be able to pivot very quickly, to be able to do new things as they're developing new tools, to be able to think very creatively about how to develop and use those tools in interesting ways. And there's some really great examples of where this can go in terms of being able to work on smaller ventures, smaller businesses, being able to do things internally within an organization to allow for that kind of flexibility. But these are the traits that we think are probably the best path forward for education to consider for all workers, for all of our students, and really any member of society going forward.
And, again, we can't wait. The political paralysis. I mean, obviously there's a lot of political problems in our country right now, and you don't have to take a side, right? It's just, there is paralysis. I mean, we're struggling to pass budgets. There's a lot of political infighting. I mean, the House is divided to one person, proposals for radical change. As I've mentioned, concern that, there's kind of reduced support for social programs. Part of it is, well, we do already have a $40 trillion debt. It doesn't bother me as much because most of the debt is not due to that. But that's the second point, right? But we cut healthcare. We decided not to extend the healthcare subsidies, and this is at a time where people are losing their jobs, and a lot of these jobs are not coming back. Like, of all the times to cut them, that's pretty difficult, right? Like, there's not a lot of oversight, right? Like, the idea now is kind of deregulation. What happens and happens. And then, it's called, we can't even count on this other slide, but kind of goes back into that Atlantic article and talks about how the history of the Bureau. It was interesting to read. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, they kind of came about because they wanted to, count some of the problems that were happening in around, especially the second wave of industrialization, when the machines could, go so fast and killed people, and we had kids working in there and all these problems. And it's kind of saying, like, maybe we should start trying to kind of keep track of what jobs are at least likely being lost to AI and some other things. So we got to kind of, that's part of it, right? That part of it is kind of building that awareness beyond is going. But yeah, we've got to, it doesn't, in a school, it takes at least a semester, right? And definitely really more than that, probably a year, right? To even just, kind of get a retooled entrepreneurship program up, right? To get to get a new minor, to get a new certificate. Right? I mean, faculty can kind of add things to their classes in most cases, but these things take time. And now we're entering the spring. We've got to start having really hard conversations about what we're going to teach people in the fall, because, it's also, there's this idea in computer science and math called a closed loop, right? And they say, well, the AI can advance faster because, it's like, well, you can verify everything and, it's kind of self-referential, but kind of worried a little bit education's becoming a little self-referential. We can teach kids certain things and then test to see whether they learn those things and whether, those developed abilities continue to develop in college. That's basically a closed loop. But but outside, it's like, well, it's a bubble, right? The negative way to say that is a bubble. And then we may have a bubble developing. So we need to start having some hard conversations.
When we think about the cascading consequences, and this is really just kind of giving a good summary of what we've been pointing to in a number of different slides. With mass job losses, you of course then lead to missed loan payments, cascading defaults, shrinking demand in the economy, and with greater job loss and instability in the economy, there's going to be political instability. And it certainly goes beyond just the economics. There are concerns about what does it mean when you lose your job, about losing your identity. Many people, especially in American society, identify themselves through their career, through their job. And that's certainly a concern. We always have seen that within recessions or big economic downturns. We're also seeing higher education enrollment in computer science falling at the graduate level because students are really seeing what's coming, and they're fearful about what might come. And if we don't deal with these shifts adequately, if we don't find a way to provide greater opportunity for students, we're really going to be testing a lot of the societal structures that we have, perhaps even democracy itself, when we're worried about that kind of level of political instability and perhaps even political legitimacy. And that's really the fear that we get to at that stage.
And I think one thing, just real quick comment on that, one way to concretize it, right, is like you have a kid and, they got interested in computer science in high school and they wanted to become a coder, and they spent 4 years in college, right, kind of working towards this thing where they're going to work in this field and be a coder. And now you're like, oh, well, there are other jobs. Like you can go be a plumber, right? Like Jeff Hinton already says that, or you can go be an electrician, and, electricians are making a lot of money now, but there's a mental reorientation, right, that has to happen, right? A kid's going to be like, well, why did I go to college for 4 years to be a plumber, regardless of how much money I can make? Or, I didn't really want to be an electrician, right? It's just kind of a different mindset. Like I said, my kids are, 19 to, right, like 22. It's like, yeah, it was kind of just assumed, do well in school. We didn't call them, I didn't say grow up and be a knowledge worker, right? But kind of like how they were oriented, and now they might have to orient in a different direction. And that's kind of hard. That's not even people who've been in a career like their whole, say till they're 30, 40 years old and now have to go adjust.
And I think this gets back to one of the points we were making earlier about the need for flexibility. It's really moving us away from very traditional approaches where we've had long timescales to prepare and plan and idealize what it is that we would like to do. And I think we have to have some flexibility built in because those jobs are changing. Even those that will persist will be very different over time. And we need to prepare students for that. And so in this slide, we start to getting at what educators can do in terms of this framework of build, judge, and lead. And for students and for educators, we really need to understand the machinery. And that comes from embedding AI across disciplines to have an understanding of how AI tools could be deployed, what they could lead to. AI literacy is certainly a foundation for that. That's really important. But the sense of being able to build and providing some sense of agency will be really important. And building will be a component of that. Then we get into judgment. And we've talked a little bit about this before, and in some of the interviews this has come up. It's a very important component. We have to be able to evaluate quality, risk, and fit. We have to be able to teach our students how to judge the output of some of the AI tools that we're using at this stage, but also then to be able to judge application and the fit and really the when we're going to be applying or how you would be using it, when a tool is appropriate, when it's dangerous to use. And this gets into a number of different applications within the educational system as we think about skilled trades, alternate pathways, and when we also start to looking at developing the practicum and the curricula that we have for this, we need to start to incorporate that in so that it's not just about the instructor providing that judgment, but we build that into the skill set that students are going to be having as well. And then we get to lead, and leading is incredibly important. Deploying responsibility, and deploying it responsibly inside real constraints, so that they start to think about what are the organizational, ethical, human constraints in a situation. And to be able to do this, portfolio-based evidence is going to be really important. Really, we've heard some even say that a 4-year degree is not really going to be the model going forward, and maybe there are other ways of going about that. And then also developing an AI use case clearinghouse is going to be important for us to use these as frameworks to figure out how can we incorporate this into our classes and into our curriculum. So there are paths forward, and there are opportunities here. And it's not to say that everything's just going to fall apart and that there's no opportunity. I think in education, it's a really rare opportunity and potential for us to be able to, if we react in time, that we can provide our students with the skill sets that will set them apart, that will make it easier for them to adapt, to have that flexibility, to develop those entrepreneurial skills for whatever they're going to be going into, and have a greater sense of agency about what their role will be in whatever they plan on doing with their lives. I think that's going to be really important for their own sense of identity, so that it's more centered and not just dependent upon a traditional role that might not be there when they graduate.
And, the bottom line, right? We don't know exactly when AI will change the market. It's starting to happen, right? But every signal, the futurists study signals. We don't even have to be fancy futurists. It's getting kind of obvious, right? It's coming fast. The economists are a little divided. But even then, they're divided about kind of the rate of change, and how difficult it will be, not whether it's going to be difficult. Politicians are obviously paralyzed. Too many educators just seem to we want to know what's going to happen. Well, it's going to be too late, and the on ramps are narrowing. The last thing I want to say is, kind of referenced earlier, we had when you were talking about the legal plugin. There's also a note on the slide about how there's a plugin for PowerPoint, for Claude Cowork, and I made these. So I want to just say, and I think this might get at the reality of how effective this technology is. I made this slideshow entirely with AI, and I didn't even use the plugin. What I did was I took those 3 articles that were referenced. And Armada's Shehu's Substack post about how the Amazon is the 16,000 we need to act, and then I went on YouTube and I got the text transcript of the podcast from the moonshots, and I said, hey, can you? I don't remember what the prompt is, but it was very simple. It was a couple sentences like, can you build me a PowerPoint presentation about the potential unemployment, potential problem of pending, that's coming, unemployment, address the arguments on both sides and include some quotes. And it built the whole PowerPoint. I didn't, and I asked it how education can respond, and it built the whole thing. And even when it built it, how the education responds, it said, well, when you've been working on some other stuff, these are some ideas like you've given. So, I'm going to incorporate that into the bottom, and it everything. There's only one minor mistake. It said 600,000 instead of 16,000, but all those other quotes are pulled right from the podcast, from the articles. All the ideas, I didn't tell it how to organize it. I didn't say like, oh, slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, slide 4. It organized everything. So. And then it's here, right? So, and us, we just make the PowerPoints, we're not like a high cost operation here, but I used to make the slides like one at a time, and I'd spend a couple hours on them here. I spent 10 minutes making these slides. And then you think, okay, other, people doing podcasts or just presentations, or they're hiring people. I mean, I don't understand, right? Like, I mean, unless you just kind of said, well, here, I made all this, and then, make some changes on your own. But, something this probably would have taken someone at least a few hours to put together, especially with all the formatting and those types of things. And it just nailed it all. It worked for like 5 minutes and it was done. I didn't edit it. So I think that kind of gives you a sense of what this technology can do.
And that's a really important point, is to recognize this isn't about what might happen. We're already seeing the technology to point that it is developing PowerPoint slides from outlines. And that's something we see just in our own everyday work. But markets are recognizing, economic markets are recognizing how disruptive it is when you have tens of billions of dollars wiped off the value of companies that are longstanding, highly respected companies, not because of a problem with that company, but because the plugins are available or the technology has advanced, a new model has come out, and they see that, hey, maybe there'll be customers that will switch from that traditional company that they've been very happy with all these years and be able to develop it on their own. If it didn't go any further, if there was no further development, we would already see, and we will continue to see that impact on financial markets and on the job market. So even if you're very skeptical, and you should be skeptical about all of this, and look at it with your eyes wide open to consider all of the possibilities, I think it's hard to deny that AI is already having a disruptive impact on what the economy is going to be looking like. And if it didn't go any further, that's still something that we need to prepare our students for. But there's every indication it's going to continue, that more of the companies are going to be integrating this into their workflow. And we need to be prepared for something that's far more disruptive, and even to consider some of the more extreme scenarios where it's a great level of job loss, that we're really worried about big sectors of the economy no longer needing human workers. And we need to prepare our students for that. And I think we can do that in a way that's empowering and that has opportunity and potential. But if we just pretend like that's not a possibility, then we're doing them a great disservice. So thank you, Stefan, for your work on this. Thank you, Claude, for the work on the PowerPoint slides. We'll have another update that'll be coming out soon to talk about some of the other changes and new models that have been coming out. But we thought it was important to focus on this issue alone for this, so that you could really look at it in a little bit more of a deep dive. And we encourage you to go find these articles and read them yourself, because this is an important discussion that's going on throughout a lot of the literature.
Yep. Thank you, Anna. It's great chat.
Great. Thanks, Stefan.